Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're at the bottom of page 1220. The text you can follow by going to ayinbeis.com. The text is posted there. So after discussing relatively at length the level of Gan Eden, what it represents, the Garden of Eden, and that is basically the domain, the area, I'm looking for the platform where the divine pleasure is experienced by souls. And specifically, it's the level of Bina, of Bria, the world of Bria, Gan Eden Elyon, the higher Gan Eden, which manifests Keser Chochma, pleasure and Chochma, and that is rooted in Malchus of Atzilus all the way to the Keser of Atzilus. So now, in this new paragraph, the bottom of page 1220, he's going to go back to, and what about the Avodah? What happens through our efforts, through our work? So we began learning this inside, but just to sum up a bit of what we learned yesterday, so he compared it to two things, two examples he gave. One is grass. The grass that grows, it's due to its mazel, its spiritual counterpart that guides it and strikes it and says, grow. So even though the grass is physical and the spiritual counterpart is not, but one is rooted in the other. And the second example he gave was from the sweetness of an apple in comparison to the koyach etzemeach, the power of growth in the earth. And when it came to the grass, he explained that grass is not just an example, it actually is the level of Amshachas Das, as he said, Ab Shin, which refers to the awareness and the understanding of the divine in Gan Eden. And that, compared to Atzilus, is like the grass compared to the mazel. And the final point was, so on one hand, Gan Eden can be equated, the pleasure in Gan Eden can be equated with the pleasure in Keser, because it's rooted there. On the other hand, he calls it Ke'ein Yesh Ma'ayin, because they're very different type of paradigms. One is far more concrete and tangible in a creation way, Bria, and the other is more ethereal and more subtle and sublime. So there's something common about them, and there's also something that's not common about, which is a common discussion, which is a common theme throughout Ayin Beis, throughout Chassidus. So when you say, for instance, physical sweetness of the fruit of an apple, compared to, let's say, the sweetness of intelligence, of mind, Mesikus Sichli, as he says, or of love and midas, a sweetness expressed emotionally, or of a song. So on one hand, they're both sweet, so they have something in common as in the word sweetness. It's not like one is completely beyond that whole concept. They both have that in common. But when it comes to the manifestation, one is far more relatable to a created entity because it can taste it. Either physically taste it, or in the case of Gan Eden, that the souls can comprehend on their terms some of the sweetness and delight. Whereas in Atzilus on its own, those souls would not be able to relate to it directly. It would remain somewhat removed. So Gan Eden therefore serves as this interface between, on one hand, experiencing divine pleasure. At the same time, it's on the terms that the souls in Biyah can relate to it. Okay. Now, as far as the worlds go, not Gan Eden, the rest of the world, there you don't even have that experience. There you cannot say that there's a revealed pleasure. The world is a creation of God's. But there, it's more concealed. and not in the way that there's something in common. In other words, you don't necessarily feel that sweetness. You can feel sweetness in hearing a song or other experiences that we have in this world, but it's not. But that sweetness is far apart. It's not a divine sweetness. It's already become a human one, a physical one. Whereas Gan Eden, it's a taste of the divine pleasure, not just of human pleasure. So basically, 3 levels. Atzilus is purely divine. Biyah, or Gan Eden, is spiritual divine. It's divine sweetness, but it's already on a created level, on the creation level. And then there's the rest of the world, which is sweetness that we experience all the time, whether it's from food or other pleasures that we have. That, yes, ultimately is rooted in those higher levels, but not in a revealed way. The neshamas and Gan Eden are actually taking delight in elikus and godliness, not in a steak and not in other sweet foods or other sweet experiences. Of course, if you think about it broadly, the goal is that we elevate all our lives to that point. But we're talking now as it is on its own, the way God created it, not through Avodah. Now, the next paragraph, which began, he says, Achai de'aveda de Torah mitzvos. Now that we know what Gan Eden is on its own, in other words, that the souls benefit from before they come to this world, what happens now once they come to this world and they do Torah mitzvos? As we learned, that's a critical component. Gan Eden is la'avda l'shamra. Yes, Adam was placed in the garden, filled with all these delights, but then the purpose was that he should serve and protect and tend and take care of this garden and make it grow and blossom even more. And what is that in the moral? Mamshichim teisvus seres began Eden. They evaded the Torah mitzvahs. Through the work of Torah mitzvahs, we draw down and we draw teisvus seres, an additional. And then he says, sheteisvos shal kodesh baruch hu meruba aleika. And this additional, when it comes to God's hamshachas, God's blessings, they're meruba ala ikar. They're more than what was there in the first place. In other words, it's not just an additional icing on the cake. It actually is more than the Gan Eden's delight as it was before this Avodah, the Avodah that we do. So what we do is we increase it more than 100%. And this is the primary receiving of reward of souls in Gan Eden, that they benefit and enjoy from the energy or the divine reflection that generated from their Torah and their Avodah, which means their Torah and Avodah in this world. Okay. So now he's going to explain what does this mean in the levels. Since we talked about Keser, Chochma, Bina, Keser, Malchus, how does this manifest? What does that mean? What are we adding that Gan Eden didn't have till now on its own? So just because that's a summary, if anybody wants to ask anything about what I just summarized, feel free to do so. If not, I'll continue now. The Ayin who. Any questions? Okay. So with 3 lines from the bottom, page 1220, says Ayin who. And here's the inyan of this, of the meaning of what we add. What do we increase? So the Inyan is the Kamoishi Yesh Pnimis V'Chitzenis B'Pchinas HaMalchus. Just as there is in Malchus itself, he's now going to introduce, there's an inner dimension and an outer dimension, like in everything. Every level always has an outer and inner dimension. So just as there is in Malchus, there's Pnimis V'Chitzenis in Malchus, V'Hainu Kanal. And what is that? What's the difference between them? It's what like we spoke earlier. Remember the difference between the worlds and Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a special place in the world. Just like in the beginning of creation, God created the whole earth. Every aspect of earth, every country, the whole globe. And yet within that, he created a Gan Eden. which was a special place. So the same thing in the spiritual dimension. There's the Olam is Bri Yitzir Asiya, and within that there's Gan Eden. And as we discussed the difference between them, he says, now what's the difference? The Be'elam is who b'chines zayin tachtein is the Malchus. The Olam is what manifests in them and what energizes them is the 7 lower spheres of Malchus. As we learned in the previous page, let's look inside just to make sure. Yeah. It's the middle of the page, 1219, the last page. So he spoke about Gimel Rishenis. And where were the Zayin Tachtenis? We're a little higher. Yeah. It's around the 15 lines from the top of the page. He said the Klolos Elam is their energy comes from Zayin Tachtenis, Ubederach Klal Nihi, Ubeprati is Malchus Sheba Malchus alone, which is what he's calling now Chitzenius HaMalchus, that's the worlds. Ubchin Zayin Tachtenis the Malchus Levat, Shezeo Bederach Klal, Bchins Chitzenius HaMalchus, that in general means the outer dimension of Malchus, the 7 lower emotions, 7 lower spheres in Malchus. Ubegan Eden, Meir, Gimel Rishen is the Malchus. In Gan Eden radiate and illuminate the 3 higher level spheres of Malchus, Keser Chochma Bina of Malchus. Shezeh B'chinas Pnimius, B'chinas Ha'aras Panim. This is the inner dimension, and he explains, because like Keser Chochma Bina is the Panim, the face, just like the Moichin is in the head, in the face, so it's a reflection. When you look at someone's face, you see much more of them than when you look at other parts of the body, because the face is a reflective of a person's soul. So it's ha'aras panim, like panim also from the word pnimius. So that's pnimius malchus. So if you look at the difference between Gan Eden and the rest of the world, or worlds, the rest of the worlds also manifest malchus, but the outer dimension. And Gan Eden manifests the inner, the 3 higher levels, the inner dimension. So now he says, so the same as it is in Malchus, there's an outer and an inner. Kamoy Kain, page 1221, the next page. Kamoy Kain yesh bezal gam kain b'chinas pnimis v'chitzenis. That's the oisfir, that's the end of the phrase. Like he said, Kamoy sheyesh, Kamoy Kain yesh. So whenever you see in a text, especially in Chassidus, Kamoy Kain, you have to look for the end of the sentence. So just that in Malchus is a pnimis v'chitzenis, the same thing in Zoh. Yes, bezal gam kem b'chinas pnimis v'chitzenis. So Zoh, which is the midas, which is higher than Malchus, also has an inner and an outer. What's the and what is that? He says, ub'chinas pnimis the Zoh. What is the inner dimension of Zoh? Zoh again, Zoh is an acronym for Zoyer Anpin. Let me just explain it in case to refresh ourselves and those that may not be familiar with it. Zoyer Anpin is Aramaic for small face. Anpin is a face, and Zoyer means small. Immediately it's contrasted with Arich Anpin, which is the lower level of Keser, is called the long face. Arich is long or large, and Anpin is face. So why is Zoyer Anpin called a small face? Because Arich Anpin is in Keser, it's Rotzen, it's a structure that's a far broader one. And Zoyer Anpin, compared to that, is called a small face, because it's the structure of the six emotions, from Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Yesod. Obviously, there's more to it than what I just said, but just as a definition. So Zoyer Anpin, Malchus is the lowest of the spheres, the 10th sphere. Zoh are the 6 above Malchus. The Midas, what we call Midas HaAdam, or Midas, not just the Adam. In the human being, it's our emotional attributes or faculties. In the divine, it's the divine emotional attributes in Atzilus. So Pnimi is the Zoh. What's the inner dimension of Zoh? Hu b'chinas Gili HaMoichin b'Zoh is the Gili HaMoichin in Zoh. Because Midas, emotions, you could also have pure emotional reactions. Like, let's say you love something, or you resist something, or you're repelled by something, or compassion, or any one of the 6 Midas. So there's the emotions, and then there's the guiding intellect or the guiding mind, reflective mind behind the emotions. Because we're not talking here just plain impulsive emotions. We're talking about emotions that are guided by and even born from contemplation. So in the midas themselves, you could have, let's say a person contemplates on the beauty of another human being and comes to the feeling of ahavta recha kamecha. Here's a soul that God put in this world, and it awakens and stimulates and arouses in you a feeling of love for another. So that feeling has two elements to it. There's the feeling of love. That's the emotion itself. And there's the moichin behind it that led you to that place. So Pnimi Zah, he's saying, is the moichin in Zah, which is called the Gimel Rishenis de Zah. Just like in Malchus, the Gimel Rishenis is the Keser Chachma Bina within Malchus, so too in the Pnimius of Zah, it's the Gimel Rishenis of Zah. Now, just in general, if you're wondering, Gimel Rishenis, you've seen, I've alluded to it. Sometimes the Gimel Rishenis is Chachma Bina Das, and sometimes it's Keser Chachma Bina, because Keser and Das are never counted together. When one is counted, the other one is not. It's not so relevant to our mimer here, the discussion why. I'll talk about that when we learn it. But here you clearly see he's focusing on Keser Chachma Bina, not on Das. Keser being, of course, Tainug and Rotzen, which is so vital to this whole discussion. Das is another role. Das is Iskashrus, connection. But he has mentioned Das. We just learned Das when he spoke about Esav, about the grass. So Das is not completely discounted here, but the main focus here is Gimel Rishenis as Keser Chachma Bina. So now he's equated. So just like Malchus has two dimensions, inner and outer, so does Zah. And Zah inner is the Moichin, the Gimel Rishenis, meaning the Chachma, the Keser Chachma Bina of Midas, basically. And what's the outer dimension of Zah? The Zayin Tachtein is the Zah. And the seven lower, which means basically the Midas Sheba Midas, that would be Zayin Tachtenis, because Zayin Tachtenis is Chesed through Malchus in Chesed in Zah. Zah is already Chesed Gvur Teferes Netzach Yisod. So the Zayin Tachtenis in the Midas, that is the Zayin Keshe'ein Behem Gili HaMeichin. When you don't have the Gili HaMeichin, it's just the Midas as they are emotions. And you don't see or you don't recognize or you don't experience the revelation of the Meichin, of the intellect, the driving mind, so-called force behind them, the Midas. So this is more chitzenius, more the outer dimension of the emotions, not to discount them, but relative to the Meichin within the Midas, this is now the Midas themselves. This is similar like Sfir Sa'emer, when we count Chesed Sheba Chesed, Gvur Sheba Chesed, that's Midas Sheba Midas. That's like the Zayin Tachtenis in the Zah, because each Midah has all the other Midas within it, just as a comparison. But here the focus is that it's on the outer dimension, meaning it's mostly on the expression of the emotions as opposed to the driving mind behind them that led to them. Now, you can say, you know what, why is it so important to have the mind? Once you love somebody, just love them. You don't have to always intellectualize it and turn it into a cerebral experience. But you have to remember, we're talking here in Avodah Hashem, having the mind is not just an intellectual experience. It's a level of deeper experience of the divine as it is on a comprehension level. That when we appreciate godliness, not just we feel for God, but we also understand God. So also in a human relationship, is one thing loving someone, but if the love comes together with also an appreciation of their personality and understanding them, knowing them in a certain way with your mind, it's not to weaken the emotion, it just deepens the emotion. That's the point here. So therefore we have in Amidas themselves in Zah, inner and outer, as we have them in Malchus. Okay, remember this is all going to be a longer explanation to come back to understand in Gan Eden itself, the difference between the core Gan Eden on its own and how Gan Eden is transformed and elevated and with additional energies through Avodah. So we need to be patient because he's going to explain more now this. But before I continue, just want to make sure this piece that I just reviewed, which is the inner and outer of Zah, is clear. And if it is, I'll just go to the next, continue. Any questions? Okay. So now that we've established there's an inner and outer to Zah, he's going to say, Ubizeh yesh kama madreges. So in general, it's two levels, inner and outer. With the meichin, with the intellect, with the mind, the higher level of gili, of meichin, which teaches us more about, as I said, about godliness, or for that matter, it's like the artist. When you have an emotional reaction to a piece of art, so you're emotionally connecting to the artist. But if you also understand the artist and what drove him to create this art, it's a deeper connection. So in general, there's two levels. But in this itself, he says there's kama madreges. In this itself, there are several levels. Dihini yadua. Because it's known, the b'midas yesh gimel madreges. Right now, we talk two levels. The gimel rishenis and zayin tachtenis, the moichin shebemidas, and the midas themselves. He says in midas, there's actually three levels. Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. So he's breaking this down further now. Now, just in case you may think he's digressing and going off to somewhere else, he's not. As we've seen till now, Chassidus and the Rebbe Rashab specifically approach to everything is very thorough. He's giving us a picture of the map. So just like we learned the picture of the map from Ani Rishon, Vani Achrin, Keser, Chachma, Bina, Zah, Malchus, and then Biyah. So now he's breaking further down in the spheres themselves, the level of Midas, Zah. Because that's now the focus that he's going to be focusing on. What is Zah? So he says, in Midas, there's three levels. There's Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. And now he's going to explain what this is. As a matter of fact, when I look at this, I don't think he's going to come back to Gan Eden. Let me see where he comes back to Gan Eden. I think it's going to be a while. So good. We're going to have to be a little patient here. If I recall correctly, yeah. I think it's going to be quite a while, to be honest. But remember, there's a lot of strings still left to be attached. I don't want to look for it now, but I think it's not so fast. But it'll be one thing will be clear: the long short road, the long short approach will appreciate all this far deeper and more comprehensively through the way the Rebbe Rashab is teaching it. So don't, many of us are thinking, okay, he's about to get back to Gan Eden. It may not be so fast, but this is how we learn. We're immersing ourselves in the whole picture now. So now he's going to say, so there are three levels in Midas now. The Keshem Shaguf Nechlak. I would even say something more additional to help along. Everything here is like one long paragraph. Because remember, there's no distinction here between Maimorim, discourses, and definitely not chapters and summaries, as it was back earlier in Ayin Beis. So in many ways, we have to create our own pauses here. So I would say that after we mentioned about Gan Eden, he's starting now a whole discussion to understand it all. Like instead of looking at it as one big paragraph and one sentence, it's actually separate chapters even though the Rebbe Rashab didn't break it into chapters, but clearly when you learn it, you see he's going now into another subject. So just from a mental point of view, just make a mental note of that we're now entering a new discussion, which would then, once we understand that, we'll get back to the earlier discussion. Now, we've been doing that since the beginning of volume 3, we have already, I think, 3 or 4 such open-ended themes that need to still be closed up. But fine, we'll get to it all. But so just be aware that we're not ignoring the fact that we have not answered the question. It's just developing, and we're going to a new section. Now, the way I see is developing it right now, it's very clear, like a whole new theme here. So, bottom line, Midas has 3 levels: Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. And he's going to explain the Keshem Shaguf Nechlak. L'gimel chalakim klolim, just like the body. When you look at a human body, you see it breaks into three main chambers or three main sections. Ve'hein, and they are reish, one, guf, v'regel, the head. The head means the whole head. Guf is the torso, the whole chest and the body, all the way to the bottom of the abdomen. And regel are the legs. So if you break, so this is a very common distinction in Gemara as well, that how the three sections of a human body: head, reish, guf, regel. Sometimes you may see it in the context where it says melach is a acronym from moyach, leiv, kaved. So moyach is of course the mind, leiv is the heart, which refers to the guf, and kaved, even though it means liver, but it's already connecting basically to the lower parts of the body. So not quite regel, but it refers similarly three sections. But that's just an aside in case you're familiar with that distinction. But reish, guf, regel. Shareish sham mishkan hameichin. Shareish sham mishkan hameichin. The head is the location, basically the sanctuary, if you wish, or mishkan, the place of residence, the domain of the mind. Where is the mind, the brain? It's in the reish, in the head. Va'aguf hu halev shesham mishkan hamidus. The guf in general obviously means is the heart, where there's the mishkan. Remember, mishkan we also use sanctuary, but sanctuary is not the right word here. Obviously, mishkan means where the midas live, where they dwell, where that's their domain. Okay, mishkan hamidus. V'zehu gufa adam, and that relates to the gufa adam. Now, of course, you could ask 1 second. There's a heart, there's lungs, there are other organs. But he's talking in general terms. Mayach, leiv, guf regel, reish guf regel, moichin midis, so chabad chagas, and then comes the third. V'reglayim hein lebar megufa. Lebar means in Aramaic outside of the body, meaning they protrude outside of the guf, meaning the top, the middle part is the guf. So lebar megufa, they protrude outward, so to speak. Their function is not for the individual themselves, as moichin and midis is what really comprises what a human being, all our functions. I should say, all our faculties that make a human, our mind and our heart, our intellect and our emotions. The Gufi says, the Reglaim, their main function is to carry the body from one place to another, to go, to walk, from mokim to mokim ukahai gavin. I mean, I don't want to sound morbid or in any way gory, but essentially, a human being can exist without legs. A human being cannot exist without a moyach and a lev. Now, obviously, that's not the emphasis here. The point being is that the guf and the reish and the guf are the two higher faculties, and the reglaim, even though they're not just the legs we know are not just carrying, just not for walking, they also have other functions. If you're wondering in this context, like where the sexual organs belong, the reproductive organs, so usually they actually go into the world of Nehi, Yesod and Malchus. But it doesn't look like he's going into that, so it's not necessarily relevant to our conversation here. But what he does say is, so just as the body breaks into these three departments, or these three sections, so now he's saying same thing with the faculties. They also break down and divide into three levels. So he's going to now explain three levels that compare to reish, guf, and regel, to the head, the body, or the heart, and the legs. And then he adds in the parentheses something connected to what we learned on previous page. Because remember, we're talking here about midas. But now he's already brought it into all the faculties, because Because in general, a human being is primarily midas. Like when we say the Adam is like a tree in a field, and the tree is comparable to midas, if you remember, Zah. It said on the top of page 1220 that Eitz Asad is Zah. So that's the primary force. Now, you'll say, isn't a human being primarily intellect? But the primary way we function is through midas. Intellect makes us human, is our superior quality compared to an animal. An animal has midas but doesn't have moichin, or it has moichin that's only about survival. And a human being has a mind that can go far beyond survival. But the primary functionality of a human being is through our midas. That's our relationships. Many of our decisions comes down to where you are. A human being is primarily, he says, and that's why Adam Eitz Asad. So what are the three sections or departments, or the three sections in the faculties? He says, Vehein Chabad, Chagas, Nihi. Chachma Bina Das is Reish, is the faculties, the Moichin. Chagas is the lev, the heart, the emotions. And Nihi, in this context, are the more functional faculties, like the legs. So even though they also carry emotions from Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, but they're compared much more to functional emotions. They're sometimes called the actual functional elements. Chesed functions through Netzach, and Gvura through Hoid, and Tiferes through Yesod. So Nihi refers to sometimes action. So if it's to speak like Machshava Dibur Maisa, Machshava relates more to Moichin, Chabad. Dibur is from the lev and heart, emotions. And Nihi is like the actionable faculties. In this context, the lowest level. The Inyan Nihi, Hein Hamida Shem B'chinis Nitzuach Bilva. Okay, before I continue, let me stop for a second. Well, he's going to explain Nihi in a minute. But let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything, to clarify anything.
Yes. It seems to be contradicting himself a little bit, calling Meichin Midas. And then he says it's Meichin. Chabad says
where do you see?
It says Midas.
Where does he call Meichin Midas?
He calls Chabad Midas.
Where?
Hine Yadua de Bemidas Yesh Gimel Madreges. Chabad Chagas Nehi.
Moichin within Midas. There's Moichin on its own. Now he's discussing. First it says in Midas you have all three, but before he does that, he wants to go and speak about in general that there are three levels. And then within the Midas, you're going to have the three levels as well.
Okay. So then when Shaguf Nachlak L'Gimel Chalakim, that's talking about.
Now he's going to the general structure of three.
The generals. Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to get back and say how in Midas itself, you also have the three.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So now really it's not a new subject. He's going to explain. Why is Nihi, seemingly Nihi is Midas? We talk about Netzach, you say, they're like emotions, especially in Spheres Eimer. We talk Netzach as in determination or ambition, and Hoid as humility or yielding, and Yesod as bonding. So he says, but when you break it down, the Inyan Nihi, Hinamidah Shem B'chinis Nitzuach Levad. They're the midas that are only an external expression. Nitzuach means victory, to be victorious, which is Netzach. So he's going to explain what that means. Misha ene chazn betivei, a person who's not naturally kind, is not naturally a kind person, or naturally a bestower of kindness, kol kach, that much, rak shemisnatseach lases chesed bepel. So, at the same time, he's going to do chesed, because the Torah says to do chesed. So bepel mamish, he's going to overcome his resistance to being about a chazdan, and he's going to do it bepel. So in actuality, Let's say, there are people, for example, who naturally love to have guests at home, or love to go give tzedakah, gemilas chasadim, to give a loan or charity. That people just have a natural. So that's chesed. What happens if a person doesn't? It's not easier for them. They're not that giving by nature, but the Torah says to be bal chesed. So he does it. He forces himself to do it. That's the Netzach within chesed, and it says b'meila ein b'zeh chayes v'tainuk. So you're going to have the chesed, but it's not going to have the vitality and the pleasure or the passion that you would when a person really is in it. He's doing it because he has to do it. And he explains, like someone, hamisakash be'ezeh dover, that is obstinate or stubborn, he becomes very fixed and stubbornly fixed on some matter. Not because his seichel has compelled him to be committed to this thing. Then you don't need stubbornness. You don't need being an obstinate. You don't need that determination. Or rather, in this case, it's only because he says, I'm going to do it because I want to overcome my challenge. Like sometimes people will do it just to prevail, not because they really feel for it or their mind is compelling them. They're doing it just to do it. There's that type of idea where people like say, oh, you challenge me? I'm going to do it. But he's talking here obviously about good things. I akshus. So in other words, it's still chesed, but it's chesed much more an external form of it.
Netzach.
Well, that's the word Netzach. So we've learned the Chassidus about Netzach and a number of things. In the Basi Lagani, he talks about Midas and Netzach as being very deeply rooted within the soul. That's why a king, the greater the king, the more he has the need to overcome adversity or adversaries. But here, the point that he wants to make here is, well, even there, it's not about the midah itself. So if someone were to say, develop your midah of chesed, your love, that would be working on chesed itself, to be more loving, to appreciate the importance of love. But then there's sometimes that you do the midah not because of that whole deeper dimension within it. It's coming from a very certain type of stubbornness or commitment, an unwavering commitment. The word stubborn is, akshus is usually stubbornness or obstinance, but also it could also mean a very strong determination. You've decided, I'm going to do this. I just want to give it a little more body and explanation. There's a mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe in Tafshin Tesh, Pesach Maimarim. It's based on the Maimarim from the Rebbe Rashab in Tafresh, I believe, Samach Tes. That he talks about that in earlier generations, the Avodah was, the earlier generations, it was Chabad. It's like they were on that level that their main Avodah was through the mind, highest level, like Der Deya. When you say that the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu was called enlightened generation, Der Deya, a knowledgeable generation. Their neshamas came from Chabad. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, we're told that the neshamas and the Avodah was primarily chagas, midas, ava, yira, love, and awe of God, but in a very profound emotional experience. And in later generations, he explains in the Maimer, the Avodah is nihi, Netzach Hoid Yesod. He talks mainly about Netzach and Hoid. And he says there, it means you may not understand everything. You may not even emotionally feel everything. But because you're told, like a soldier, that's the example given, like a soldier, a foot soldier, and you're commanded to do it, so the midas hanetzachim within you says, I'm going to do it simply out of determination. Not because I feel it deeply or I understand it well. And Hoid, he compares, he says, that's netzachim. Hoid is Kabbalah Sel. You're just accepting Hoid, Haidah, Moida Ani. I'm doing it because I accept the yoke. I acknowledge and I accept my role. It's commitment. Basically, determination and commitment, he explains, is the main avodah in our time. So even if you don't have all the giluyim of all deeper spiritual revelations and high understanding of godliness or emotional, but there's Netzach and hate. He doesn't talk about Yesod, I don't think. But the point being is, it helps understand a bit what he's saying here, because like here, it seems like he suddenly went into this Netzach out of the blue, but he's trying to explain how Nihi is the emotions, but it's the lowest level, like the regel within it all, which is more focused on the functional, on getting it done, on the actionability and the function of the midas, as opposed to the profound feelings themselves. So even though he doesn't feel, like he says, he doesn't have chayis and tainug in it, but he does it. It's a determination and a commitment. That's what he's explaining here, why Nehi is in these three levels is the lowest of the three. Now, in those Maimorim, actually, it has a certain power over all of them, because that determination can break through anything. But that's not the focus here. There, the focus is more on explaining that. So in Nitzuach Bilvad, okay. Now in the parentheses he adds, elsewhere it's explained, Sha'akshus yes b'zeh tam nelam. Based on what we just learned, akshus is just determination. I don't need a reason. The Rebbe told me, go be a shliach. I don't need to fully understand why. I don't need to feel it. Go do the job. You have a shlichus, go do it. It's a type of commitment, a type of unwavering determination. I'll do whatever it takes. But he says elsewhere it explains that akshus, this type of determination or very stubborn determination, has in it a tam nelam. It's not completely without a reason. It has a concealed reason. Hanikra tam komus. So nela means concealed or hidden. Komus means like covered up. That's the name for it, tam komus. A covered up or concealed reason. Hainu, and the reason for that is because Nihi really, in truth, is rooted higher. So he's hinting to what I just explained. So in truth, in Giluyim, like we spoke about Malchus, if you remember, in Revelation, Ava and Yira and Teferes, Rachamim, Chesed, Gvur, Teferes are far more firepower emotionally. Whereas Nihi, you're doing it because you're just committed to it, in determination. Even if you don't feel it, like he said, even if there's no chayis and tainug, you don't have any particular vitality or passion in it, but you do it. But nevertheless, there's a deeper reason behind the scenes on a super conscious level. And because Nihi really is rooted in a higher place, but it's not really the discussion right now. That's why it's a parenthesis, but he's qualifying it just to give us the whole picture here. So Nihi does have something that's from a higher place. Okay.
We're the generation of Nihi.
We are. And that's why the foot soldiers, he says in Basilagani, that God, when the king splurges, when the king splurges all his treasures that he only reveals in a time of war to win over an enemy, who does he give it to? The foot soldiers. As a matter of fact, when the Rebbe in Tovshin Ches in 1948, when he gave that talk about the lessons from chess, the game of chess, I had the merit of preparing that. So when he speaks about the pawn, he says it's only the pawn, the foot soldier in the front line, that protects all the others that are far greater officers. The rook, the knight, what's another name for the bishop, whatever. And of course, the king and the queen. So it's the pawn that has the power to become a queen when it comes to the other end, because in the lowest, you have the power to reach the highest. The Rebbe says, he compares the pawn becoming the queen is like the foot soldiers, Nihi, accessing its steepest source. Okay. But in the context of what we're talking about, Nihi is the lowest level in comparison to the actual midas emotions, the full-blown emotions of Chagas, and which is Guf, and Reish is the Moichin. So you have Moichin, you have Reish, Guf, Regel, Moichin, Chabad chagas nihi. That's what we've established. Now, he continues on, I see, with this Netzach, level of Netzach. Ubeprotius, and more specifically, Inyan ha-Netzachu, this idea of concept of Netzach, a victory of determination, hu shemenatzeach ba'atzmei lasa is gam she'ena reitze b'tivei be'etzem. More specifically, so till now he used Netzach as in terms that even if a person is not a Baal Chesed, he determines to do so. He seems to say now, he's going deeper, that you overcome within yourself. The person overcomes within himself to do something that he fundamentally by nature doesn't want to do. To do something that he fundamentally is not interested, does not want to do. Or even more than that. In other words, not just to do something he doesn't want to do, but to do something opposite of his nature. That even if it's by nature, he wants something or doesn't want something, he goes and does something against his nature in a form of just purely nitzuach, to prove that he wants to win and prevail. Simply due to that. This too is one of the emotions, of the natural emotions of a human being. To overcome his own resistance, basically. It's also a midah. That's what he says. So it's a midah, but it's a different type of midah than the midas of chesed, gvura, tiferes. Now, why he adds this seems to me he's trying to explain more what Netzach is, because based on what he just added, you could say Netzach then is not just a doing chesed, forcing yourself to do chesed. He's now saying it's a whole midah. So why is it then the level of regel? Why is it not one of the emotions that is at a higher level? Not sure. This addition that he added now, does that make Netzach a lower level or makes it a stronger level? Just wondering out loud, to be honest. But let me finish the subject and maybe, what?
Stronger.
I know. So why would he bring it here? He's trying to explain that Netzach is like chitzenius hamidus, so to speak. Maybe because it's not like when you love someone, it's, you love someone. When you're overcoming yourself, it's true, it's a midah, but it's still not a midah as you're expressing yourself. It's a power to overcome yourself. I think that's probably the pshat. So it's a midah, but it's a different type of midah.
Power to do good. It's the power to do good that ultimately we have to force ourselves to do good.
Yeah, here he says is the power to overcome resistance, to overcome, to control. Like when you say, Ezu Gibber Hakevish Es Yitzrei, who is the strong one, the one who conquers his Yetzer? Sounds a little like that. A person who, even though there it's Gvura, Gibber, but L'natzeich Es Atzmei, meaning to like there's a certain, I don't want to say pleasure, but a certain drive to control yourself, to own yourself, to overcome. Okay, that's Netzach. What about Hoid? Remember I said Netzach is pure determination. Hoid is acknowledging. You're doing it only he's doing it because another commanded him to do it. So Hoid is adding something over Netzach, because on his own, he doesn't have the power. He doesn't have the power to overcome and control and win over himself. Only when another, like his teacher or his guide, He's using Meira, Melamed, and Madrich. Mitzav Alov, that's when he does it. So Netzach is a midah where you yourself are overcoming your own resistance and doing something either that you don't want to do or an opposite of your nature. Hoid adds an element that sometimes Netzach is not enough. So you need to have someone that commands, that tells you this is what you have to do. So here too, it's not a midah per se like Chesed Gvura where you feel for it. It has to come from a force outside of you. I think that's the pshat. So Netzach means it's a force within you, but to overcome your natural midah. And Hoid is you need something to command you to do it. So though it goes in the category of human faculties, but it's lower than actual midas like Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. That's clearly what's coming out here. V'yeshleimer, he says in the parentheses, the Zeh Inyan Sha Netzach Hu Anaf HaChesed V'Hoid Anaf HaGvura. Anaf HaChesed V'Anaf HaGvura. That Netzach is the branch of Chesed. Remember, Chesed is on the right, and Netzach is a branch also on the right, and Hoid is a branch of Gvura. So how would we go this? So Netzach is the Anaf HaChesed. How does that work? Which part of it? Why is determination and conquering yourself a form of Chesed, and listening to a command a form of Gvura? I guess because a command means you're listening. You're like you're the Gvura and Yira of your teacher or your guide is what's driving you. It's coming more from a Gvura place, like the authority. Whereas Netzach is coming more from an overpowering place within you.
Chesed is action. You are active. So it's Anaf HaChesed. That's Netzach. Gvura is the opposite. You are restrain yourself. So the Hoid is not having yourself the koyach. You need something, maybe.
Well, so it seems like Netzach is self-determination, and you're driving yourself from within to act outwardly. Like Chesed is Ratzo, it's moving outward, and Hod is like Gvura because you're like Rabbi Teichel said, you're refraining from you're in fear of you're holding back from doing something wrong, let's say, because you're afraid of it's against what you were told to do. So self-determination, you have to come something from within to push yourself outward to do something. And Hod, you may be acting outwardly nevertheless, but you're doing it because you're afraid of what happens if you don't do what you've been told. You're refraining. There's a yira. There's a deference to something, and that deference is what's causing the action.
The thing is that by Netzach, the Rebbe Rashab said that it's also you're doing it because you're doing something against your nature. So it's not just a matter of determination. It's due to determination, but you're also going against something. So in other words, there's something that's driving you to not follow your own nature or to go against your nature.
But the direction is action. You do. That's why it's Netzach and not Chesed, because
but Hoid, you're also doing. You're following what they're guiding you to do.
Well, it's a positive reason.
You are following. You don't have to do it yourself.
Okay, all the thoughts are good. I'll give it a little more thought myself. I'm not negating what anyone said. I'm just thinking about it, because. Okay.
What is Hoid? He's saying majesty, the king.
No. Let's not add things. He said what Hoid is. Hoid is.
But
one second. But the Rebbe Rashab said it's Esau Petzivu Hazulas. He's not bringing Hoid from the word majesty, and he's talking about that element. So I don't know if you want to explain this with other elements of Hoid and Netzach. I can do that plenty. Because there's many places explains why Netzach is an extension of Chesed. This is not the only place in Chassidus this is discussed. I'm talking about the Yesh Leimer that what ze inyan, that was he's talking here, is what makes Netzach. In many places, Chassidus explains why Netzach is chesed and why Hoyd is gvura. But so yeah, but
majesty is also restraining. Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, so this is all speculation, as I told you, bringing from other places. He doesn't speak about majesty here. That's the thing. He doesn't mention majesty.
How
It's a form of self-negation.
What is
that you're being mevatel yourself.
Yeah.
For someone else.
That is compared to gvura, yeah.
But
Netzach, he also said, is a negation. You're negating your nature. You're going against your nature.
But that's coming from yourself.
So that makes it chesed because it comes from yourself. That makes it chesed.
It's the tam kamus. It comes from a positive reason.
You're expressing yourself.
Okay, as I said, I heard what you said. I'm not arguing. I'm just thinking, because chesed, you're also overcoming your natural tendency. The only difference is you're not doing it because you're listening to someone. You're doing it from within. So maybe that's the distinction. As I said, it's very possible. Okay, fine. I'm going to stop here because now he's going to go. That's Nehi or Netzach. He didn't talk about Yesod. And then he's going to go back to Chagas, I see. And then Chabad. So we're going to go now. He's going from Nehi, Chagas, Chabad. And with that, he's explaining, just to sum up, the three sections or the three dimensions within the Midas, or in general, within the Gufa Adam, the faculties, Chabad, Chagas, Nehi. Okay. And this is all coming as a continuation from Pnimius and Chitzenius Zah. So now he's breaking it down further into three. So Pnimius, Chitzenius Zah. We'll talk about Avodah. Okay, fine.
He said that, interesting, that the Nehi, Shorshon Lemailo Miyeso.
Yeah, okay. And I explained that to a certain extent. Okay. So we'll stop here by Chagas Henguf.